collect all the urine over 200 days. And then at the end of Monumental, I assume that you drained it, right? So, and that reminds me of another piece that you have performed many times called Becoming an Image. This is the piece in which you basically attack a clay bash, and then at the end, the clay is dismantled into smaller amounts. And you told me last time you were here that you typically give that away to local art students, right? So my question for you is, I would love to hear you talk about that part of your process, about the part where it disseminates, how it kind of dismantles itself at the end.
All right. Firstly, that doc is so weird. Every time I see it, I'm like, oh, it's got this strange tone. It's kind of humorous, but the process was actually, and I feel like they keep talking about my marriage and showing my wedding ring. It's this like very normative, bizarre, it's not really representative, but it is, you know, because there was so much going on, I didn't actually document it myself, so it's like a strange placeholder. So I just wanted to say that. It's like, God, it's odd to watch. In terms of dismantling, yes, a lot of my works have a very laborious sort of, almost like a thesis-like process that I'm going to execute, but this was really a gut reaction. You know, after this ordinance was rescinded, the next day I was like, you know, we should all just FedEx our piss to the White House, like tomorrow, you know, UPS it, let's go. And I was going through an immigration process of becoming a citizen, and my lawyer was like, don't do that. It's a biohazard. It's actually a felony to ship biohazards in the mail. And so I decided to instead go the realm of the metaphor. And this being an exhibition in a commercial gallery, Ron Feldman, who I work with, who's a man of incredible integrity, was kind of joking, and he's like, Cassils, how are we going to keep the lights on? I'm like, what are you talking about? You don't think someone's going to buy my 200 gallons of piss? He said, no, I do not think so. So so of course, when it came to the act of having to store it, this is not something that was really feasible. And so obviously the piss was flushed. Which makes it an ephemeral process, like most of my works, as I said, kind of early on in that doc. Like the work, I make many different kinds of works in a broad spectrum of mediums, but it always kind of stems from the germ of a live performance. And performance is an ephemeral, it's an ephemeral act. And so the act of being present, being there for it, is different than seeing the document. There's many different, but there's, you know, something like this, there's so many different punctuations that you can enter into it, and it has different meanings at different times. But the act of, even the act of collecting, actually, out of the 200 days, because I'd made this commitment of 200 days, I had travel plans lined up, and so for 30 of those 200, I was out of the country already. And so I actually had to get proxies, because it wasn't about my body, it was about a body. It was about how much fluid can be indexed as a result of an oppressive government ordinance pressing down on a human being. And that was one of the reasons why I decided to push back on representation, similarly with Becoming an Image. So it wasn't about Gavin's body, it wasn't about my body, it was about a body. And so for 30 of those 200 days, I had people, friends of mine, volunteer to piss for me. And so that was like a really interesting sort of accidental part of the project, in that it brought people who were maybe cis and didn't have this kind of relationship to public, or this anxiety around public urination, or any of the stigmas that you encounter when you're constantly stigmatized. And I think it made those people have a tremendous amount of like empathy, where maybe they might have had a more apathetic relationship, by having them hyper-perform this very kind of benign thing that we all do every day and tend to take for granted. So it's a way of disseminating, you know, like flushing and getting rid of, but also kind of finding ways of bringing and folding other people into the work. And then in terms of the clay, like sometimes it gets given to art students, sometimes it goes on Craigslist, sometimes it goes to like a ceramics youth lab. That particular piece is made of a modeling clay that is made for stop motion animation. So it's not meant to be fired, it's not meant to be fixed, which is kind of a lovely coincidence when you're talking about unforeclosed identity and a constant mutation of identity. And so it just makes sense to pass it forward and give it new life.
Yeah. Well, in both Becoming an Image and in PIST, along with many of your other works, there's this performance aspect, and then there's the life after of that performance, where people are discussing it and people are looking at images or documentaries. That actually makes me think of your question, GM. Do you want to get us started?
Yeah. Yes. So I'm particularly interested in that state of, wait, is it on? Okay, cool, thanks. In that state of becoming and in that state of sort of like constant change as the result or whatever. I'm interested, since your body is your primary art material, I'd just like to hear more about your relationship with embodiment, both as a person and like within your practice. I think like being in that state requires like a lot of vulnerability. Yeah, so I'd love to hear more about that.
Well, I think we're set up to believe that we go from point A to point B. You know, this idea of transition, for example. But what are we transitioning to? I mean, of course, there is reasons. There are certain folks that feel like an identity that is somewhat fixed. But even fixed identities fluctuate, you know? And I feel like there is a tremendous sort of pressure that's placed upon people to have a certain particular set of points that they check in order to become something. And so working with the body, not just as a medium, but also, you know, FYI, News Bulletin artists don't really make a lot of money, so you need a day job. And the day job that I've had for the last 20 years is running a personal training business. And so what I do with that, mostly I don't deal with like making people into meatheads. I deal with a lot of like injury and rehabilitation. And so much of it is about this analog process of responding to stimuli and being cognizant of this concept of what's called periodization in training, which is that you can't just like go and put yourself under brute force and then reach that quote-unquote goal. The goal is an ever-shifting goalpost, and in order for that to be sustainable, you have to constantly look, be present, and see if there's like a certain strain, if there's a kind of injury that's occurring, how to work around that injury, and then to move forward. And so I feel like I apply that practice, which is this kind of metaphor for living, to my daily life, and also to, I guess, my ethos as an artist.
Jump in on that. You're sitting right next to me, so you're going to see me read from my notes.
That's cool.
That's all good. But I recently revisited some of your artist talks, and there's a statement that you made, which is pretty, like, applies to any sort of training, but that sometimes you don't know that you've used a muscle until it's sore, which I've held on to. And as an artist working through the body, finding ways to open it, empathize, and set aside its perceived limitations, I'm interested to hear how you approach a new work, find a beginning, and how you deal with frustration in your practice when your body is your main material.
Mm. I think it's interesting. I pride myself on being careful. People look at a lot of my work and they think, oh my God, you're pressing yourself up against blocks of ice, you're lighting yourself on fire, that there's an assumption that there's a sort of recklessness. But actually, in order to be able to do any of this, you need to really undergo a scrupulous process of research on how to do it, because the idea isn't to harm myself, it's to achieve a certain state that pushes people and myself, but in a way that is sustainable to a certain extent, a place where I can keep going. And so I'd say a place that I start is often usually a problem, something that I want to investigate. There's so much in our world that is beyond our control. I think something like Inextinguishable Fire, for example, was a piece that was made in 2015 on the heels of Ferguson and Baltimore, and the various uprisings that were occurring. And at that time, the dialogue in the media was that, there's very particular framing depending on, and this is of course something that we understand very well now with the current administration in place, but at that point it wasn't such an obvious dialogue, which was that certain people were constructing ideas of truth around representation. Is this vigilantes and hoodlums, or are these people like speaking out about necessary civil rights, demanding to be heard? All of that being framed with the cut of an image. And so, for example, in that piece, I was thinking about how much representation affects the way that we think of truths, and specifically that piece is titled after a work of the same name, also called Inextinguishable Fire by Herm Farocki. And there's a moment in his film, it was made in right around the Vietnam War, where he's smoking a cigarette, and he looks into the lens of the camera, and he says, the embers of this cigarette burn at 300 degrees, napalm burns at 3,000 degrees, and then he extinguishes the cigarette in his arm. And he's not doing that as like a metaphor for pain, he's doing it as a way of indexing his removal from the possibility of understanding what it would be like to be doused in napalm. And so I guess I was thinking of living in Hollywood, which is like the site of industrialized production of imagery, as a sort of contemporary iteration. And so I guess that's the sort of process that I think about. I certainly look towards past artists. I think of, we can learn tremendous amounts from past artists, and thinking about the cyclical natures of oppression, how those artists in the past have responded as such. I had the good fortune to see Emory Douglas, the quote-unquote Minister of Propaganda of the Black Panthers, speak. He's about 75 years old. And all these young artists were asking, what do we do now? What do we say? And he said that it's not an artist's job to change politics per se, but it is the artist's job to inspire the culture of change, the culture of politics, if you will. So I don't know if I have a specific A to B in terms of my process per se, but I'm kind of always cooking like several pots at once and distilling like anything from art history to like what does it mean now, and like how does media interact and affect the way that we read things, and what is the current specificity? How does a body respond? How can I use my body to engage empathy with someone who might have a completely different body? And so I think about all those things, and then I really try to like distill it into the actual formal process. Like we kind of started the film not at the very beginning, but it starts with me taking a breath, because that full body burn is performed over 14 seconds. And the only way you can perform a burn is to exhale. If you breathe in, you will burn your throat. And it starts with the sound of my own inhalation. You hear the blood literally rushing through my body. And as the camera zooms out slowly, over time you hear at the very end the body burning across the room from you. So it's this idea of how do we think about the viscerality of common experience and that distance? How does media play into that? So, I don't know, that's kind of a very blah answer, but.
That's the point of the question.
Yeah, there you go. There you go.
I was just going to follow up on that because it started to get into what I was going to ask. Something I lock onto in your work is the way in which trans subjectivity is kind of, like you said, like distilled down into sort of a specific, like represented dynamic, or a kind of away from an unmediated direct image of the body. So I think that within that conversation, I'm curious how you feel like your work sort of accounts for intersectional experiences within this trans umbrella when we start to talk about the issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I first started making work, well, I've been making work forever, but maybe when my first work started getting more recognition or being viewed publicly, it was like kind of in probably about 2011. And I think at that time, we didn't have the word non-binary. That didn't exist. I kind of think of trans years like dog years. There's like so many developments in terms of the process of the way that we can speak about these things, that that language literally wasn't there then. So, I mean, that's one of the reasons I love art, is that I think that we can kind of get really caught up on language. People like fight wars over language. We argue over words, but there is something about a visual that offers a way in beyond this kind of getting caught on the tongue, if you will. And I think that for me, because in the early days, it was about me trying to literally find myself in a way. And I think now I'm in a position where I'm interested less in about myself and more about, I mean, and it wasn't ever just about myself per se. If you talk about oneself, it's like oneself as a representation and a way in to talk about larger social structures and paradigms from a first-person experience, right? But I think the works that I've been making have changed. They've gone from this kind of like, wake up, to, okay, you know, it's one thing to say the sky is falling, but when the sky has fallen and we are in clouds, then what, right? And so I've been thinking more about ways of creating these sorts of rituals or ways of making works that, that bring varying subjectivities together. So, you know, for example, the clay bash, which is the remnant from Becoming an Image, has since been cast into a bronze casting. So it's like this crazy 2,000-pound, actually it's like I think it's a 1,300-pound sculpture. And initially I'd proposed to put it in sites where acts of violence against gender nonconforming people had occurred, but only having one sculpture and there being so many sites, like how do you wrestle with that? And so instead I had this idea to, whenever we would bring the sculpture to a place, so for example, it had its premiere in Omaha, Nebraska, shortly after the election, which is like a red state, middle of nowhere, basically. I worked very closely with this very young curator and the local LGBT community, and we found different people who lived in that city that spoke to radically different experiences. So, you know, we tend to think of this LGBTQI+ like as this like umbrella that is all encapsulating. But in that, for example, there was a young man named Dominique Morgan who was like, came out as queer and his family threw him out in the street when he was quite young. He turned tricks to survive. He was picked up by the police. He was put in the largest prison industrial complex in the Midwest, and he was incarcerated and put into solitary to protect him from being raped, and this was the prison system for dealing with an out gay man. And so he wanted for us to place the sculpture in front of that prison. Then there was an elder gentleman who was in his late 60s who had founded the first ever gay pride parade. Back in 1984, when it was such a scandal to be out and gay, that people in the parade wore paper shopping bags over their heads to disguise their, you know, they had to be anonymous. And even people that were watching the parade wore paper shopping bags. And this is like a lived experience of an elder gay white man. And so it was about really allowing for these different kinds of trauma and the way that oppression pushes down on what we think of as like a common umbrella, but under this, there's so many different kinds of privilege that exist even within that. And for me, it's about, you know, us being aware of each other's struggle and supporting each other in that. And I think that art, again, ahead of language, is a way that can facilitate that kind of openness, right? Because how are you going to move a 2,000-pound sculpture without like a whole ton of bodies, especially when there's no steering mechanism or brakes, you know? So it's about taking these things that were kind of physical strifes and struggles for myself and then kind of making them sort of shared experiences without drawing specific conclusions. If anything, it's about trying to make space for the diversity of experience within that and being present and honoring that difference. You know, I really think that's, you know, my job right now.
One thing that you said a minute ago when you were talking about having other people collect their urine for piss, is you said that it allowed them to have an empathetic experience. So you are showing the work in Houston next year, and you said that for that iteration of PIST, you're actually doing like a community collection.
Right.
Is that along the same lines of sort of an empathetic experience?
Yeah, so I'm doing, the show Monumental is going to a museum in Houston, Texas. It's opening in November of this year. And I'm adding on to it. I'm making a bunch of other works. But that cube is definitely, the show will be called Fluid. And it kind of, it shifts the dialogue a little bit, but what I really wanted to do was to make a 640-gallon tank, because that would be the index of how much time has passed since that ordinance. But the cost of making a 640 gallon, it's like literally like, it's something sick, like 25 grand or something. And at that point, you know, even if you could fundraise that, to me that's like, that becomes an ethical quandary. Like, do you spend that money, you know?
What size would it be? It would be enormous.
It would be a 600, so it would probably be like, I mean, it would be incredible looking, but it would also be like just cost prohibitive. And so what we will do is, and again, about it not being my urine, it will be about, we're doing like a civic urine drive. And again, I'm always like one of those people that look at public sculptures and go, what is this? I call it plop art, you know, when you're like driving downtown and there's like some abstract, you're like, what the hell is that? You know, why is this here? And not, you know, but I think that, you know, there's a way of creating and engaging public, like the public. And so I had this idea of, based on this experience of having people really be moved through the act of donating over those 30 days. So we're doing like a public urine drive in Houston. And so I've been to Houston, I've met with a bunch of community collaborators, we're dispersing bottles, there's an instructional video, and we're gonna try to gather from like starting next week up until November 3rd, as much urine as we can. So for sure we'll fill the tank, and then ideally if I could make that 640 gallon mark, we'll just have the gallery like lined with fridges. So it becomes an act of solidarity, albeit a metaphoric one, a symbolic one, but something where it takes your body through a process, you know.
So Peter, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, and I almost want to be like, do you want a question that's a response to all these other things that have been said, or do you want my like photo-specific question about antiquity and history?
Please, whatever you like.
I'm gonna just first read you my little question,
Sure.
and then, sorry, my brain is like, wow, so many things, I want to know about this and that. So I'll just ask, I believe you play with photography in the ways that someone who is invested in its theories and questions does, through what is and as importantly isn't shown, through the relationship between viewer and lens, and through the complex histories of images. How does your awareness of image making that critically engages with and recategorizes antiquity, minimalism, conceptualism, etc., work to further your socio-political artistic intentions? I'm specifically interested in your keen understanding of imagery about the body as it relates to antiquity, thinking about alchemic and the sort of quiet power of Tiresias. Oh, stop.
So something like Becoming an Image, which is this piece where I'm attacking this 2,000-pound clay block in pitch darkness that's only made visible when a photograph is taken. The images that you see from that really don't encapsulate the experience of seeing it live, because what it does is it hijacks the physiology of your eyeball. And in fact, maybe the physiology of your body, depending on your height, depending on the way your eye functions. You know, all of this really affects the way that you see the image, but it doesn't look like a photograph. What it does look like is almost like a black and white hologram that very aggressively burns itself into your eye and then floats up. So I was interested in making people cognizant not just of the ways in which photography and this kind of like, you know, critical moment that stands in for the performance, and so is so often upheld as like the document. You know, I wanted to kind of interrogate that. And not only that, you know, as a performance artist, maybe, I don't know how many of you are photographers, but in the United States, whoever presses the button on the camera is the owner of that image. So even if it's my art, it's my idea, it's my concept, unless I have a contract in place with the photographer, if they take a photograph, they own my body, they own my image. And so this was also in a way a response to, I mean, the work, whenever it is performed, there is like a demand for a white male photographer. So it's very much about evading and problematizing and playing with that gaze. Because of course, just as I am blind, he is completely blind. And it becomes this act of like, it becomes really like a dance. And rather than it being about photography in that moment, it becomes about an instrument of light, an instrument of visibility, and really like a kind of tug of war between us in that. And for example, you know, of course, I'm thinking back to things like Muybridge and the study of movement. And often in my works, I don't really repeat over and over again, but something like Becoming an Image, I will repeat my whole life, because already since I started it in 2010 up to now, I can see when I look back at the thousands of photographs that have been shot that there's already an aging process in my body. And so this is the thing I'm going to do as a life work till I'm like 80, and it will inevitably be like a really long stop motion film. You know, so I'm always thinking about like, how does the document speak to the live work, but how is it can never represent. It can never represent. There's something that is absolutely, you cannot substitute for the energy and the power of liveness, which is why it's so awesome that you guys have this opportunity to see all these performances tonight, tomorrow. There's something about that presence, especially now when we're all so like, you know, glued to our devices. But then, you know, I guess I think of making art like I like to think of the art like a sponge, right? Porous with many holes. I'm aware of the fact that in this country, we don't teach like music and art in high school anymore, right? So like most people don't know who like, you know, Marcel Duchamp is, let alone Picasso. And then that's not anyone's fault. That's a fault of a culture that's no longer valuing this kind of visual production. And so that knowing that and not wanting to just make, and knowing that of course my work will just automatically be viewed as elitist because I'm coming from a tradition, I am educated and I have all of this bounty and history and knowledge, but I'm also interested in, is there a way that I can make something that like someone who doesn't know anything about anything or not anything about anything, but maybe hasn't had that very specific art historical education, can they still connect? You know, and maybe will it make them interested to look it up and learn about something from that. And so, yes, you know, you can have an MFA or an art history degree, and you can like reference Judd, and you can reference, you know, Eleanor Antin, and you can reference, you know, all these different kinds of things that I've been thinking about. But I also want to find a way of like using those lessons and trying to folding it forward and like making those dialogues relevant and available to people now. So it's definitely about riffing off all of that art history, but also about kind of trying to think about how to bring that forward now in a time where there's actually not that much value placed on it.
May I ask a follow-up?
Yeah?
So with that, I mean, I think titling is clearly important with your work and does sort of provide that like I don't know, needle hole through which one can go on their own and figure out, unless they've like seen the performance or something. And with that, like, I wonder still about how you deal with, and I know this is a question that Colin sort of has too about abstraction, so I'm not going to like dive too deep into it, but about like placing the resilience of the 20% in a space where people might not have access to that understanding, and how like you can sort of activate a public piece, an abstract piece, something that almost requires like a bit of, like a little push into understanding, and how do you sort of operate within that space?
Well, I think like resilience of 20%, which is the name of the bronze sculpture, you come across that if you come across a push. It's not placed publicly anywhere now. So or you see it in the context of a show which speaks to and unpacks it. You know, you see photographs of becoming an image. You see the film that I've made that kind of documents the process. So it's viewed within the context that kind of not spells it out, but places it within a larger context so you can kind of read it, I guess. But on another level, I guess that piece to me is really, if we're talking about abstraction, I never thought about making a sculpture when I made that piece. It was only after I did the performance for the first time I was like, man, that's a cool sculpture. You know, like, because really what it is a faithful index of a blind attack. You know, and although it is made by my body, it speaks to a history of accumulated marks, a history of accumulated violence. And it is like every single mark on that piece is formed by an elbow, a knee, and a fist. So it's really about the multiplicity. And though it is fixed in bronze, the other thing that I do is I haven't put a closed patina on it, which means that usually in a bronze sculpture you finish it, you can finish it dark, you can finish it any different color or whatnot, and you fix it. But actually leaving it unpatinaed, what that means is any hand that pushes on it or touches it, the oil from that finger then becomes part of the mark of that sculpture. So this, if it's outside in rain, the drop of rain becomes marked and etched. So again, it becomes an index of how it is treated. So if it is if it is placed publicly, if it is like touched literally by human touch, as you often see like bronze sculptures in public spaces, someone like touches the nose of the dude or whatever, and it's shining. There's literally the act of touching the work brings out the beauty of its property. If it is neglected or not taken care of, it will mutate and grow. So I guess I don't know if that answers your question, but
Yeah.
yeah.
And sparks so many more.
Well, I think this would actually be a great time, because it does spark so many more questions, to open it up to a broader conversation. If the panel is okay with it? Okay. So I'm going to, thank you. So we're gonna,
Speak into the microphone.
Oh my God. That sounds stressful, guys.
I know, I was about to say, not an intimidating
You can also just
situation
yell
at
if
all.
you like. I'm cool with that.
I can pass the microphone up also.
I'm going to kick us off with a question related to something that both GM and Taylor asked about. And I wanted to ask if an additional material, in addition to your body, that I am just really pulling away from the work and seeing it now for multiple times, is exhaustion and rage, and queer rage. And I think there's, we're having like a lovely discussion about everything, and you are such an eloquent speaker about your work. And I wonder, what are the moments when you're allowed more publicly to have that rage, and is that embedded in the work? I think there are so many tangible ways in which it is, but I don't know, I just wanted to hear more of your thoughts on that. So many of the works are pushing not only your body, but a body, our body, to the brink.
Yeah.
And I think that just becomes such a part of the materiality of the work the more I think about it.
I think like rage is part of of the cycle of emotion that we undergo, right? I don't know, for something like Pissed, for example, when this Vice video, which I don't even really like that much, went up, there were 17,000 dislikes, and they had to disable comments. And I started to get crazy, death threats, hate mail, someone contacting me on my artist page on Facebook through Messenger and being like, hey, I saw your piece, it really resonated, thank you. I'd respond, they'd be like, fucking dyke, I wish I had my fingers around your throat. Live, you're like, wow, okay. And there has been moments where, not particularly with this, but I've had experiences in the past where, especially for things like social media, where you have people just say these crazy things to you. And there's been moments where I've responded fuck you, There's been moments where I really unravel and I become super angry. But then that's really obviously unproductive, right? And so, for example, with this person who said they wanted to put their fingers around my throat, I was like, who is this Yahoo? I looked him up, his Facebook profile was open. He was some 20-year-old kid in the Midwest or something. I was like, you want to meet for a coffee? And he was like, yeah, sure, I'll meet you for, And then he was like, JK, I live in the Midwest. I'm like, mm-hmm. And we ended up having this bizarre dialogue because he was kind of but for real, I want to know, how can you be a trans when a man and a woman made you? And I'm like, wow, this is a question he has, So I'm like, I'm going to break it down for him. So I just wrote, this has been around for a very long time. You may not be aware, but, And then I was looking at his Facebook feed, and I was like, this dude, he hunts, he fishes. He clearly has a relative, probably a brother, with Down syndrome, because there were all these videos of Down syndrome kids playing football, and it wasn't making fun of. It was clearly an adoration. And my eldest brother is severely autistic and has special needs. And I was like, dude, you don't know me. I can see you have someone in your family with Down syndrome. I have a brother with special needs. Life is hard. Why hate on me right now? You don't know me, And he was kind of yeah, you know what? You're right. Sometimes I just get to trolling at night, and I'm sorry. And I was like, okay. Oh, I'm glad we worked that out. But no, but but that kind of effort is really above and beyond on my part. And it was like, for me, it was like a bit of an anthropological experiment because I had reacted so poorly to someone else. I had posted there's like, you know, the ACT UP slogan, which is a pink triangle that says silence equals death. And there was a kind of reactivation of that, which was like, like a black and white iteration of that graphic that said, white silence equals death. And I had posted that, and some like raging homosexual in Canada freaked out on me and was like, how dare you reuse the tool of my struggle to talk about something. And I was like, what, these are interconnected, you know? And that's who I went haywire on, was that guy. And it was such a horrible sort of feeling. So, I mean, I think, yes, there is rage, right? Like, and yes, we can access that, and I think literally that's why I exercise so much. It's a way of literally like taking demons out of me. And I think that there is space and need for that, but I also think there's ways of like repurposing that energy, you know, and like, I practice a lot of martial arts, and there's like this idea of taking the force of violence or the anger or whatever that stuff is that's coming at you and just like moving it out of the way and just repurposing it. Like if you can do that, it's really enlightened. It's very hard. Can't always get there. But it's something that we absolutely need to rise to that right now. You know, there's like no other choice really. I mean, yeah.
So I noticed that a lot of your works deal with the elements as some form of the medium, be it like fire, ice with water, or even in pist as well as clay as earth, and air, encapsulated breaths. That's something where I've like noticed how the elements really can be kind of metaphors for our emotions as well as things that are necessary for life and death and transformation in many forms. So I'm just kind of curious, like, what is your favorite element? What do you identify with the most and why?
I'm a Libra. I don't know if I have a favorite element. My dad is, he's like I'll call him a problematic environmentalist, meaning like, ever since I was tiny, he'd be like talking about the ozone layer. And, you know, really like he would do crazy things like elm trees are, you know, almost wiped off the planet. And every time we would pass an elm tree, he'd pull over the car and be like, look at the elm tree. It's the last one you'll ever see. You know, and so I grew up with this kind of like deep knowledge of extinction and and I think, you know, like, people think like this time is no different than others. You know, we've always gone through these systems of oppression and resilience and whatnot. But the thing that is different about then and now is that our planet's resources are finite and they are running out. And we are not able to sustain this kind of human pandemonium in a way without considering the aspects of the planet. And so I guess just as I think that our human struggles are intertwined, we are so as well intertwined with every single living being and aspect of this planet. And so I guess I think the elements are some way of speaking about that interconnectedness, for lack of sounding like a bit cheesy or reductive. But you know, there is that interdependence, and there's a tremendous kind of like human-centricness in our society. But like, you know, I don't know. There's so much more sentience than we ever kind of give like presence to. And so I guess working with elements is a way of kind of plugging into that for myself. Someone who isn't quote unquote religious, but is kind of looking for some kind of like way back into a spiritual practice of finding that interconnectedness.
It actually reminds me of an interview with Ron Athey, where he's talking about how he is like, Ron Athey is a performance artist based in California, and you've actually done some work with him recently.
We're about to do a brand new piece.
Okay.
Yeah.
Phenomenal foundational performance artist. Spent some time with Ron Athey today. So anyway, he was talking about how he's coming from a place of religion, And in the absence of religion in his life, he's really looking towards the earth and the cosmos and trying to find power within those sources. But specifically, and this is what reminded me of that, from both a sense of power and destruction, but also a sense of healing. Do you see that also how you're using elements in your work as like, not just recognizing that they're limited, but also using their energy as a power source?
I mean, honestly, I don't know if I've thought about it so much, you know, to be honest. I think like, it's a way, I think human beings can be really arrogant, and there's something that's really arresting, and again, it's another kind of out of control and chaos that is provided by, you know, fire, for example. There's a certain way you can control, but there's certain inherent risks where you can't, you know? And so I think there's something about interacting with that larger power force as a way of being cognizant of your place, you know? Like of realizing, I don't know if I have a really articulate answer for it.
That's just a kind of a tangential thought.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have a question?
Go ahead.
So you were saying that your earlier work focused on kind of finding yourself and your identity before there was language to define that. Was there, and now your work is very much like about social commentary and about like this bigger picture, was there kind of like a moment or a point where you knew that you kind of needed to take your work into a bigger scale?
A bigger scale, like how?
Like taking it out of just your personal experience.
So, you know, I come from a history of studying like 70s conceptual performance work, you know, looking at a legacy of artists that speak from their own experiences, which I do think, again, I don't think that means that it's specific to that one person's body. It's just a way of being honest, if really, you know. But I do think people get hung upon my body because it is like a muscular body. It's like a body that can be fetishized. And that's, you know, that's a Trojan horse mechanism for me to maybe like bring you in on some level. But there's much more to my work than that. And I was feeling frustrated by that kind of limitation, and also the kind of, I guess, the limited read on just like, not to say that, of course my work is about transpolitik, right? Of course it is. But there's so much more, right? And so also wanting to kind of push back on the kind of sticking points of representation, to start obscuring my body with darkness, with flame, with ice, using these different lenses to obscure. That being said, I think it's radically important to showcase queer bodies, different bodies, disabled bodies, bodies that are not the normative, and to give those kind of credence. But I felt like that's not really the only note I want to play, if that makes sense. And so was there a moment? Yeah, I think there was a moment, and I think the moment was probably like leading up to this moment we're in now. Was realizing that, you know, this is a moment where we need to start working beyond our own lived experience in order to move forward, and that's necessary. So, yeah.
I have a thing. This might just be a reflection. It might formulate itself into a question, or will spur something else. But tying together what Aaron was saying about rage, and then like hearing your anecdote about your father and the elm tree, of just like, look at this tree, like, don't you understand? Like, I think so much, and this is slightly trite to say, of the problem of like what you're talking about with these people online giving you such negative pushback is you're not visible to them yet. Like, they don't understand, they haven't seen that experience, they're just not with it yet. But the thing that I think is such a strength in your work is that in the performance, you create situations for that encounter for them, not just like as you as a person, but like in the becoming an image, the people who are watching that performance are constantly having to like mediate what their experience is and like the thoughts they're having of like, is that, like, should I be thinking that? Like, why am I like worried so much about like who this individual person is, as far as like trying to identify like your body or gender or what have you? Yeah, could you like talk about how, I mean, do you like think about engineering those moments?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Something like Inextinguishable Fire, for example, is actually, it's not a film, it was a live performance and a film, meant to be seen back to back. It was performed only once, because no one in this country will take on that liability. So I performed at the National Theatre in London, in England, and it was, I mean, they even had, like, they tried to do it kind of down low, but they definitely had a psychologist there evaluating me, who kind of sauntered up to me and was like, so, how do you feel today? I'm like, I feel of sound mind and body, and I'm not taking anyone down with me, don't worry, you know, like, but very, you know, what I was thinking about was just, you know, again, 2015, which feels like a different time, really, in terms of, like, the way that we've become used to Twitter and Instagram, mediation, constant 24/7, like, inundation. I wanted to specifically use the technology to parse apart the liveness and the mediated. And so that piece was performed live on stage. I found a stunt team in the UK who is like really pretty good, had like done a ton of James Bond films, felt really adept as a stunt coordinator, and was very cocky and confident. And as they were preparing me, which is like you see me layered in that goop, you actually have to be in a state of hypothermia in order to perform that stunt, because it's not so much that the fire will burn through the protective clothing, but it's that you will start to perspire whilst on fire, and that the heat mixed with your perspiration will burn you and give you third-degree burns. So you need to be in a hypothermic state, ironically, at the same time that you're being set on fire. And so what I did is, like, in the film, we have this trope of the opening of the lens, which starts on my body, which is literally a blank canvas, and then it moves off my body. You're like, what is this? It's a canvas, it's on fire, it's a body on fire. Whose body is this? Is this a traumatized body? Is this a image for, what is this image? Wait, we're on a black background. Are we exterior? Is it interior? Is it night? Wait, we're on a sunset. I hear crickets. Are we outside? Wait, it's a film studio. So it's playing with all the ways in which we are processing this kind of sensory information to make sense of an image. How do you do that when you're working live, right? When you have no camera to control the gaze. So instead I used sound. I had hidden microphones planted all over the stage. And the sound designer who I worked with for this piece, who's Cadet Kuhn, who's an incredible artist who I've worked with for the last 5 years, and she does all of my sound with me. For example, the sound that we use in this, you hear the body literally, we shot the film in a day, but the sound took 6 months. And we made the sample, it's all samples, so we were like hiding in a fireplace, like this, because you hear the sound of the fabric singeing as if it's on your own body, you know, versus, so we were making hundreds and hundreds of fire samples. But to do that live, what we did is I just slowly brought up the sound on stage. So this guy who was this very cavalier stunt coordinator who was like prepping me, and the thing that he underestimated was like, yeah, sure, he's done 1 million James Bond films and he's a big film and television dude, but he'd never been on stage in front of a sold-out audience at the National Theatre. And so the dude got nervous. So he's preparing me and his hands are shaking, and he's like putting the scoop in my nose, and of course the only way I can like go through this is through exhaling, and I can't breathe. He's like literally blocking my airways. So there is this like, so the performance starts when I'm like basically in underwear on stage, and the lights in the theater, I told them to leave it like in between productions, like when the janitor comes in. I don't want it to be set, you know? So considered and considered, as I call it. As the people are loading in and taking their seats, that's actually when the performance starts. And as the sound comes up and you start to hear this kind of banter between the stunt team and myself, and with this like unrehearsed, totally genuine moment happened, you know, that being amplified, and just like the audience being like, good Lord, you know, and this 14 seconds of flame, of which goes black, and I go off stage, and then that same audience is taken outside to look at a large-scale production, like bigger than this, maybe like 2 times the size, on the side of the South Bank Center, which is a huge building that's on a public walkway where literally thousands of people pass every day. And for that same audience to watch like hundreds of people just walk by and not even notice, you know? And so it was really, in a way, like that was like the perfect experience for me, was to have that experience of witnessing something live and then seeing how it's mediated. And Becoming an Image is like a much lighter version of that. But it's very much playing with mediation and the way that an image is taken, and then like making that something that's physical and visceral, that implicates. I'm interested in the audience as witness, as opposed to just like popcorn chewing spectator. Yeah.
May I ask about, because watching Inextinguishable Fire again, like when I first saw that piece stuck with me so much, and particularly the sound design, because so much of it is sort of horror themed, and some of it is actually quite like beautiful. And then it got me to thinking about a lot of the dichotomies in your work between, and I think really well exemplified, in that you have to be in a state of hypothermia in order to be burned, and like how this sort of duality of something like horrific and something beautiful potentially can lead to like an optimism in terms of politics or like social being, and especially with the pose. And there's this moment when you go down that you're actually just erased. Like it's just the fire extinguisher fluid and flame. And then that happens again, and you're coming back up is like, it's like beyond resilience, right? It's almost like rebirth. It's reclaiming this fire. It's extinguishing it yourself. Like, so I'm kind of curious if you see an optimism in your work through rage and pain and horror, or if it's more a reflection of those.
I don't know if I was thinking about it as optimism per se, but I was seeing it as cyclic, as these kind of like necessary cycles that repeat historically. And I think it's all of that, you know. I do feel that there is, I don't know. There is horror and there is beauty. These are all the things, this is all the stuff of life, right? Without sounding like waxing too, like, without being too generalized. I do hope for, I don't know if an optimism is the right way, but I do hope for a way out. And I do hope to think in an imaginative way that allows people to engage their own imaginations. Because that's the one thing about human beings. So we're at this point, for example, with the Earth, where we're running out of resources and whatnot, but the one thing that we need to also account for is human ingenuity. And actually, humans do have a certain sense of ingenuity, and that is a part of being a human being. That is also, as much as we're hell-bent on this Hobbesian idea of self-destruction, right? There is also this property within human beings to be resilient, to have resources, to figure things. So I think it's about the tenuous poles of both those aspects of living, that we experience,
Can I ask, I'm going to holler because I don't want to walk down there. But,
Sure.
Can I ask a question in relation to this? Because I think there's something that hasn't quite been touched on in relation to the history of image. In the Inextinguishable Fire, your arms are out like Christ, actually.
Right.
And then there's this notion of martyrdom. I'm sitting up here thinking, does Christianity own the image of martyrdom?
Yeah.
And I wonder about your relationship to the history of Christian imagery.
Okay. So I'm going to be totally like point blank with you and tell you this. I didn't anticipate or think of, as much as I thought of everything, I didn't anticipate this gesture. And the reason why this gesture is that way is because when you're performing a full body burn, generally you're moving, you're running, you're like someone's chasing you, you're on fire. And that action of moving allows, you're able to manipulate the air around you to move the fire off your body. When you're doing a static burn, which is apparently, unbeknownst to me until I chose this moment, like the most dangerous of burns, because you're actually like a matchstick, right? You're standing and fire goes up. That's hence when you see the the kind of frame open, you see that fan blowing. So you see how the air is being manipulated off my body. This action is actually a way of dispersing the flame away from me. So if I were to stand with my arms by my side, my whole face would go up. So it's a way of like opening the fire and literally, so formally, it was not something that I had anticipated. It was not something that I had anticipated. In being in dialogue of like an image of martyrdom per se, an image of, I guess I was thinking more about perhaps images of Joan of Arc, or thinking about specifically really like engaged by Faroki's image of using imagery to critique imagery. So I don't see it as this simple act of just martyrdom. I see it more of an act of talking about that specific moment of when do we stop relating to a trauma of another, right? So the ember in the flesh is not metaphoric for the pain of the Vietnamese. It's an index of removal. And at this time in 2015, with Ferguson and like watching all this go on and just like reading about it and having no, like, how do I have access to this? Like, there's being transparent about my removal, you know, which is like a different position than I feel I have now towards my art. But I think at that point I was really struggling with ethically, how do we deal with this as as me being like, you know, a white Canadian artist in this country looking at this mess we're in. You know, I think like looking back to Haroun Faroki's work was like a way of speaking about the Vietnamese crisis in an honest way of like wanting to bring awareness, but being very cognizant of his position of removal in relationship to that, and being honest about that. So rather than it being about Christian imagery, which of course it does become because of this extended arms, right? But just to be straightforward, it was not something that I had anticipated.
And I hate to do this because this is so interesting, but we have to end it now because we have other performances that need the space.
Perfect.
Sorry.
Thank you guys. Thank you for your time.
Thank you all so much.
Hey folks, we do hope that you all will stay. It's a brown bag lunch. The conversation can continue. We are just moving out of the auditorium. There's some tables, chairs, impromptu space set up outside. Hang around. I understand there are also other ICA artists who are also hanging around. So yes, hang around.